So this is going to be an interview between Julia on your left and Linda on your right. And let me do an intro of Linda, and then Linda's going to introduce Julia. So Linda Liebelt is a longtime volunteer and former co-chair of Mickaboo's phone screen team. She's also the proud parent to Wally, who is a Nanday Conure who's not joining Linda at the moment. But Wally loves seeing his mom shop for toys. Whenever, toy making parties, holiday auctions, summer auctions, toys, 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 more toys, can't have enough toys. So we are going to turn it over to the two of them. And they ask that that you understand that questions will be answered by them, but at the end. So they've got a whole presentation set up and it'll flow quite nicely. And we will see your questions come across, use either Q&A or chat, and we will answer them in due course. So with that, I'm turning it over to Linda.
Hi, thanks, Pam. I'm Linda Liebelt, a longtime volunteer, and Julia and I have something really fun in common. We both traveled a lot to Australia, also to New Zealand and some of the other places around. But today we're going to focus on Julia's travels to Australia. Particularly the regions of Kakadu National Park in the Northwest Territory and the York Peninsula and the islands beyond that in Queensland. And so those are way up in the north. Now, my first trip there was in 1997 with my late husband, Wolfgang. And to use a local colloquialism, we were totally gobsmacked by the diversity of species. And I think you could see in the photos here, this is some of the species we'll cover. And it took us a while to understand. And actually, I'm glad that for the program about genetics that was on before us, when you discover species of everything on islands, you have to keep in mind that in many ways, these island habitats are isolated from the rest of the continent. So any breeding and anything like that is going on separately, which is why we found things all over Oz and all over New Zealand you don't find in the wild anywhere else unless they were introduced by humans. So that's the reason there's so many unusual things. And this, of course, is what Darwin found in the Galapagos Islands and led him to write The Origin of Species in 1859. Anyway, Julia Keller, beside me, is also a longtime volunteer for Mickaboo. And your first trip to down under to Oz was in March of 2023. Is that right?
That's correct.
Since then, you've been back again and again, and during your travels, you've observed many wild species, probably more than I did, birds, and have decided to focus on these two areas of interest, the cassowaries of the York Peninsula and the birds of Kakadu. So let's begin with the cassowaries.
All right.
A little bit of research on Wikipedia, but tell us more about these unique living fossils, would you please?
Okay, so they're feathered dinosaurs that are still living amongst people in Australia and New Guinea, and also some other places in Indonesia. They evolved 60 million years ago from a group of carnivorous dinosaurs known as theropods. It's what's interesting is that they are mostly vegetarian today, and they have a very important purpose of helping to maintain the rainforests because of their diet. They belong to a group of birds known as the ratites, which includes ostriches and emus. Emus, that in Australia they would correct you, it's emu. These birds have no keel bones, and they occur on all southern continents except for Antarctica. And the cassowary is divided into three main species: the Australian southern cassowary, the northern cassowary, and the dwarf cassowary. The northern and dwarf cassowaries mainly occur in New Guinea. The Australian southern cassowary is native to Queensland. Sorry, Chico wants to participate in this. You can hear him in the background. Who's not cassowary? Chico is my severe macaw. At any rate, and in Australia, in Queensland, the Australian southern cassowary mainly, there are two key populations. One is in Cape York, as Linda was mentioning, and the other is in the wet tropics, which occurs in the Daintree forest all the way down to the Cassowary coast. So if you're familiar with Australia, Queensland is in the upper right-hand corner of the continent. And the town of Cairns, it's spelled Cairns, but it's pronounced Cairns. Australians take the R's out of a lot of words and they add in R's on the ends where they aren't in English. But up and around Cairns, there's a region called the Cassowary Coast, which is mainly south of Cairns, around Mission Beach and Wangaling Beach. That area is known as the Cassowary Coast. Cassowaries are listed by the Australian government as endangered, primarily the population in the wet tropics around Cairns, due to habitat destruction and human encounters. In the area around Cairns, there has been since the Europeans settled in Queensland, there's been a very robust sugarcane trade. So a lot of the area was deforested to grow sugarcane crops. They are still growing sugarcane, as well as doing some logging, but a lot of the logging is going away. So habitat destruction and then human encounters have become the other main reason why the cassowaries of the wet tropics are in danger. Car strikes are the main problem that they're having. It's interesting when you're driving around the Cassowary Coast, there are signs everywhere saying that if you encounter a cassowary that is down, that has been hit by a car, they list on the sign the phone number to call, and one of their wildlife centers will go out and pick up the bird and try to rehab it. But the cars are a big issue. Part of the reason why the population in Cape York is doing better is because there are no paved roads going to Point York or Cape York. In order to get up there, you've got to be in a four-wheel drive vehicle. It's all off-road or fly in on a small private plane. So the lack of people up there has been very beneficial for the cassowary.
You know, I remember well getting up to the tip of the York Peninsula right after a humongous rainstorm in a four-wheel drive all-terrain vehicle, and it was a bumpy ride. I mean, there was not a lot of traffic on the road. But you know, it interests me that you know, these are listed as endangered due to habitat destruction, as you mentioned. Many species living in these islands, as elsewhere on other islands, happen to be habitat specific. So once you take away the habitat, the bird has nowhere else to go. There are examples, really dramatic ones, like the koalas, which had a much larger range when the species of eucalyptus that they ate was more widespread, but now it seems to be limited to Kangaroo Island and a few other places. And also with the famous giant pandas in China, they eat a specific kind of bamboo. So if you take away the habitat, they can no longer live. So when we spoke, you and I, Julia, earlier about discussing what topics for this interview we should cover, you mentioned that the government of Australia has worked closely with the Indigenous or Aboriginal population to jointly monitor and manage the species and habitats in Kakadu Park. We'll talk about Kakadu later, but this program has been successful largely because the government and the Aboriginals share equally the responsibility for this management. Is there a similar program to this taking place with the Cassowaries? And tell us more about it, how it works, how is it managed, what is its funding mechanism, and where does the money come from? Thank you.
Well, interestingly, Australia, in terms of their government, is very, very supportive of trying to support the native species in Australia. They do realize and recognize that, as you mentioned, they have evolved completely separately from the rest of the world. So they do have a lot of weird and wonderful creatures that you will not find anywhere else. From tree kangaroos to Tasmanian devils to creatures like this, the cassowary, which they're one of my very favorite birds. So because of that, Australia is very conscientious of preserving them. And the government does support with finances and any other support it can offer. There are some key groups that are working on it. In the wet tropics, particularly, which is in far north Queensland. So again, that's like the Daintree rainforest all the way down to Mission Beach. The wet tropics management, the wet tropics authority is an organization. They're a nonprofit organization, but they get a lot of support from the government. And they also employ a lot of Aboriginal people who have historically maintained the land and been stewards of the animals there. And as we'll mention later on with Kakadu, the Australian government does give the Aboriginal people that are interested in working in these positions, they give them lots of authority in terms of how we manage these wild populations. So that has been really interesting to me, that the Australian government's really committed to trying to save all of their native creatures. And they're also they call upon the Aboriginal people for the wisdom in terms of how they have used, maintained these populations for thousands of years.
I'm just curious to know, is there a dedicated is there a dedicated budget specifically for the parks? I mean, is it like a budget set aside that this much every year will be used to establish new ones or maintain Kakadu, the Daintree rainforest and other areas so that they could protect the habitats?
Interestingly, so, here in the United States, we're used to our national parks being part of the national park system. And the national park system receives the funding and then disperses it to the national parks. All the national parks are run jointly under the same authority. In Australia, they haven't quite gotten there with their national park system. So they don't have a system, to be honest. Every state maintains their national parks differently, and they all operate differently. So the government, it's kind of a park by park basis that the government gets in and does their thing, either with funding or whatnot. So for instance, like if you wanted to buy a national parks pass when you go to Australia, you can't. Some parks charge admission, some parks don't. Some parks, they're run completely independently of one another and not under one consortium or system. But that said, as I mentioned, the government does, when they are asked for help with funding and that sort of thing, the Australian government is pretty generous in trying to support the efforts.
To what extent are the Aboriginals allowed to control who has access to the park and anything else, any of the parts of the park, such as Uluru in the center of the country? To what extent do they have ultimate control? Does government pass laws and make all the decisions?
Again, it's park by park. Just as an example, with Kakadu National Park, which we'll be talking in a little more depth about soon, the government is very committed with Kakadu because Kakadu is the traditional home to a lot of Aboriginal groups. Kakadu is also home to 30% of the endemic species of birds in Australia. So the government operates it jointly with the Aboriginal people, and deferredly Aboriginal people, basically for all of the policies and that sort of thing in the park. It's also in Kakadu National Park, the park runs right up to the Alligator River. An irony, since there are no alligators in Australia, only crocodiles, but one of the European colonizers that came to Australia named the river system the Alligator River because they didn't know the difference between alligators and crocs. So at any rate, on the western side of the Alligator River system, just a minute, I'm going to close my door. Chico and now Joey, my own San Francisco conure, is joining in. At any rate, so on the western side of the Alligator River, it is part of the national park, Kakadu National Park. On the east side of the Alligator River is what's called Arnhem Land, and that is a traditional land of the Aboriginals. You are not allowed, basically anyone who is not Aboriginal is not allowed to set foot on Arnhem Land without being invited expressly by the Aboriginal people there. That said, the Alligator River is very popular for being able to view wildlife and other things in Kakadu. So in terms of the river itself, the national park does have one vendor that offers like boats and safaris of sorts up and down the river. That said, there is an Aboriginal vendor that offers those rides as well and tours. I was able to get in on one of those in July and to go birding up and down the Alligator River. And it was operated by an Aboriginal gentleman, and which was fascinating. And he did allow us to get off of the boat onto Arnhem Land. But we were given 15 minutes. We were given a very specific parameter of where we could go, with the understanding that it is sacred land to them, and a stern warning to shuffle your feet because there are dangerous snakes. So, but again, it's this combined effort where the Australian government really does respect and defer to the Aboriginal people for the maintenance of the land.
Okay, that's good to know. Now, are there similar programs for protecting the cassowaries? Are there any regions that are, other than the fact that getting up to the tip of the York Peninsula is a bit challenging, are there any other regions that are completely off limits by a decision of the Aboriginals? Also, is there different management programs on New Guinea and the Moluccas and other islands, or do they interact together?
They're fairly separate, but in terms of Aboriginals working with the Australian Southern Cassowary, the Wet Tropics Management Authority does have, I would say about half of their staffing is Aboriginal, and they operate the protected cassowary corridors in along the Cassowary coast and up into the Daintree. So they work for cassowary conservation on a number of levels. They also run the rehab facilities for when a cassowary, for instance, does get hit by a car, or chicks are found that are orphaned, or whatever that is. So there are Aboriginals working side by side with other Australians to do the conservation work. They also work for funding, and they are busy trying to buy up as much land as possible as a nonprofit to protect the cassowary corridor. So they're constantly looking for donations and having fundraisers. And they just recently last month bought another large plot of land up close to Daintree. And again, they're trying to protect those corridors for the cassowary, keeping cars out and trying to keep people out to a certain extent. As I was going to talk about later, but maybe this is appropriate. They are having a very similar problem right now along the cassowary coast to the problem that Yosemite has had with bears. People go and want to feed the cassowaries and have been doing so, you know, as tourists. The problem is that they're now getting very habituated to humans, which, of course, I didn't mind in the sense that I was able to get pretty close up to a lot of these guys for photographing them. And I just found them really fascinating to be able to observe up close. But I also had one approach me for a piece of pizza. And the problem is that these guys are massive, and the males do have a spur on the back of those very powerful legs. Uh, and they always talk about how cassowaries can kill people. Although I have heard it said that there have only been 3 people in history that have been killed by a cassowary. Don't fact check me on that because I don't know that for sure. But at any rate, I would say that's probably accurate that not a lot of people have actually been killed by them, but they do have the power to do a lot of damage should they want to. And I think the Australians are very concerned that it might become like the bears in the sense that if they get too habituated to humans and then they do start injuring humans to get the piece of pizza, they're going to have to start putting them down, and they're already having trouble with the numbers at this point. So, yeah, so that's become an issue.
Okay, well, everybody hear that. You're on warning. Don't feed the cassowaries when you go.
And this
So
is
I have one question I want somebody at raise this. Is that how much smaller or larger are the dwarf and the other cassowaries from each other?
so the northern cassowary, I don't have a picture of them here, but they exist mainly in New Guinea. They are roughly the same size as the southern. I think maybe a little smaller, but not. There's not an appreciable difference. The dwarf cassowary, I have never actually seen one, so I don't know a whole lot about them.
Okay. And in your future trips, what do you plan to focus on? Are you going to spend more time in specific sanctuaries or studying them in a specific way or what?
I'm hoping for next. I would love to go back for Kakadu Bird Week, and we'll get to that in a minute. Because Kakadu, as I said, is home to 30% of the endemic birds in Australia, and that is an amazing place. I also Bruny Island, which is off the southern tip of Tasmania, has a bird festival every other year. So I am planning to attend that in March of 26. A lot of the big birders from all over Australia go to that birding festival. But in terms of habitats, I do want to get to the Kimberleys, which is kind of on the border of Northern Territory and Western Australia. And I have yet to get down into Western Australia, Perth, Kangaroo Island, all those fun places. Rottnest Island, of course, that's not really for birds. You're going there to see the little cute creatures. And I have not made it down into the Red Center yet. Last July, I was in Darwin and Kakadu, and I only got as far south as Lichfield National Park, which is south of Darwin, but I didn't have the time to make the drive all the way down to Alice Springs. And there are birds in that area that I would love to be able to see.
Yeah, I recommend if you're going out to the Kimberleys, that's way up there, out there in the north. It's one of the hottest places in Australia. and take a small plane. They do
Mm,
have places to land, and we stayed on the archaeological field station there. It's
mhm.
pretty primitive, but
Right.
the rangers and the archaeologists actually do field work out there and work closely with the Aboriginals in the area. It was very interesting. If you don't,
Most of the Northern Territory is pretty primitive.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah.
we'll see a lot of budgerigars. I mean,
Yes.
flocks and flocks of them.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on now. You know, we did talk a bit about the you know, the conservation programs in Kakadu. But you know, this magnificent, huge park, Kakadu, is home to more than 280 species of birds. And there are probably a lot more than that even. And it's truly nirvana for birders, um,
Right.
especially if you're camping out there. They have places where you could stay, but if you're in a campgrounds, they're all over the place. They're all around you, but so are the snakes. But you could see, I love these two posters about
Yeah,
the
these were taken at Eddie Bay. Um, so Eddie Bay is a camp, it's a beach just outside of Mission Beach, between Innisfail and Mission Beach. Um, and it's a known cassowary habitat. The cassowaries enjoy the beach. It's very funny to see birds like this walking down the beach at sunset. But there's also a campground there, and the birds have become very habituated to that because they know that campers will sometimes cook food and leave it on the ground, and they've become scavengers around the campground. So I found these two signs and around the campground, and I found them very humorous. I especially found it humorous when I found a cassowary back at the lodge staring at my car. I was a little concerned. Uh, this is I was staying at Likwala Lodge, which is in Mission Beach, between Mission Beach and Wangling Beach. This is a birder lodge. They only have 4 rooms, and if you ever get to Queensland, I highly recommend this place. It is amazing. They grow a lot of fruit there on the property, and it's right in the middle of the cassowary corridor. So the cassowaries do come through the property all hours of the day. But this guy decided my car looked very interesting. So I kept my distance and took a picture of him checking out my car. Fortunately, he didn't do any damage. But
And you want to keep your doors closed too, because I understand they'll get right in the car with you and
yes, yes.
them out.
Yeah, yeah, yes. Okay. So on to the birds of Kakadu. Yeah, so 30% of all endemic Australian bird species can be found in Kakadu National Park, which is part of the Northern Territory. It's about 3 hours outside of Darwin by car. Um, it's very remote feeling when you're driving out there because you're just going for kilometers and kilometers of nothing, and you'll find burned out cars along the side of the road that just get abandoned. Um, the park is run, managed, and maintained as a joint effort between the Australian government and the Indigenous Aboriginals. The Australian government allows the Aboriginals to lead on issues concerning the conservation and stewardship of all the park assets, including the birds. This next photo, this is just an example of how they defer to the Aboriginals. So for thousands of years, the Aboriginals have worked the land by doing what they call patchwork burning year round. So they burn in small patches year round to help reinvigorate the growth of the flora and fauna. Um, and the government has allowed them to continue to do that. So this was there in the middle of July. I have to admit, being from California, where fires are always on our radar. The first morning I was in Kakadu and I smelled smoke and I saw this, I was like, oh my gosh, have we got to run? But no, this is just part of their everyday life up there, where they do the patchwork burning, using the traditional Aboriginal methods. And this picture was taken over the Yellow Waters Billabong, which is really the birders' paradise in Kakadu.
Um, did you use primarily local guides, Aboriginal guides? What was your experience of that?
So when we were in Kakadu, when I did the Yellow Waters Billabong, I actually used the park runs service of boats that go up and down the Billabong. So I was able to hire that one. Then to do the Alligator River, I went with the Aboriginal boat operator for that particular one. Um, and then I did when I was in uh I did not hire a professional birder in Northern Territory. Um, I usually, when I go to a new state in Australia, I typically hire a professional birder to spend a day with them. But I did not do that while I was in the Northern Territory. But I was able to see some really amazing stuff just on my own, especially this venture on the Yellow Waters Billabong. Like this picture here, this is the boat actually didn't even see this little guy until we were practically on top of him. But this is a comb-crested jacana, which is native to the area. And you can see, it's hard to see in this picture, but the comb-crested jacana, it's a male. He's in kind of in the middle left upper of the photo. And he has three little chicks. And you can kind of see one of them kind of lower right, sort of. So we parked the boat there for a minute, and once the dad, and this was the male jacana, so it was the dad. Once he realized that the boat was that close, he gathered up all the chicks underneath him, and it was very cute. Um, but
They call those the Jesus birds because
yes, they walk on water. Yes, I haven't heard that since Kakadu. Um, this is an interesting picture. This is the black-necked stork, also known as Jabiru, and Jabiru is actually one of the main villages in Kakadu. And I stayed in Jabiru. They have a hotel that's in the middle of nowhere. But it's in this little village of Jabiru, and the hotel is shaped like a crocodile. Very interesting. But we saw this Jabiru, the black-necked stork, and a crocodile at sunset. And it's just so interesting to see them together. I was kind of worried when we were taking this cruise that, we're going to see crocodiles eating things that I didn't want them to eat. But they're very lazy hunters. So I've got some other pictures later of birds walking right next to crocodiles. Crocodiles really don't want to make a big effort to go hunting. They'd rather something just like walk into their mouth. And they can lay there for days, and they can like turn down all their metabolism and everything to just lay there and wait for something to come. So the birds tend to be kind of okay with that.
I guess they're used to it.
Yes. This is a white-bellied sea eagle, which is amazing. So there was a pair of them that had a nest. We were able to see the nest far up in the tree. I have no idea if there were any chicks in it at the time. But I've also seen the white-bellied sea eagle outside of Port Douglas, which is in Queensland. And these are amazing, huge, very just striking, beautiful birds. And this is a picture, closer up picture of a jabiru, which is the black-necked stork, and the pied heron, and a Nankeen night heron. And these are magpie geese. So it's hard to see from this picture, but they are black and white like the Australian magpie. So very interesting thing. Here's this other picture, the pied heron with a freshwater crocodile, also known as a freshie. There are freshies and there are salties in the crocodile world. This is a freshie. But you can see that the pied heron is not overly concerned about walking right past the croc because the croc's kind of not interested in going out of his way. So at any rate, kind of interesting stuff. And this was an Australasian darter. And then organizations on Australia working on bird conservation. As I mentioned, the Wet Tropics Management Authority does a lot with the cassowaries. There's also a smaller organization on the Cassowary Coast known as Community for Coastal and Cassowary Conservation, or 4Cs. It's a much smaller local organization, but they are also working, they have a nursery where they are growing plants that are specific to things that the cassowaries like to eat, and then they're trying to get out and get those planted. There is a particular, the Davidson plum, for instance, is something that the cassowaries love. It is not, humans do not like to eat it. Cassowaries love it, so they're growing a lot of, 4Cs is working on growing a lot of these. They like fruit that often falls to the ground. Again, they're not super ambitious. So they'll take, fruit that's fallen to the ground. And the other really interesting thing about cassowaries is that they do spread the seeds for these fruits, and have been responsible for keeping the rainforest going. So again, really important from an ecological standpoint. They do serve a real purpose. Because they can eat the fruits with bigger seeds and distribute them on a pretty wide basis. And then the Australian government, as I mentioned, I'm just going to give a quick example of a non-bird thing, because it's a good example of how the Australian government has gotten in to really try to promote their native species. The Tasmanian devil, their numbers in the past 20 years have declined by 80%. And it's mainly due to a disease called it's a facial tumor disease, and it's spread. So when the Tasmanian devils are carnivorous, they're strictly carnivorous, and when they find carrion to feed on, often a large group of them will come together to feed, and they will bite at each other, and that spreads this facial tumor disease. So I said their population declined by 80% in 20 years. So the Australian government and the Tasmanian government, so Tasmania is a state within Australia, but together the two governments have developed a program where they are building an insurance population of Tasmanian devils. They've rounded up all of the healthy species or specimens they can find and put them in captive programs and sanctuaries to keep them separated from the wild specimens that are infected with a facial tumor disease. And in the meantime, they have piggybacked off of COVID. They were using the mRNA technology to develop a vaccination against this disease. And right now it's in its final approval process. Once that happens, and once they have captively bred enough Tasmanian devils that are healthy, their plan is to start vaccinating groups of them and re-releasing them into the wild, with the hope of being able to build back the wild population and one that's immune to this disease. So again, a lot of the government has played a critical role in that process and has provided much of the funding and the science behind that. So yeah.
They've also, I understand, have banned feeding Tasmanian devils the leftover scraps in the hotels at night just to entertain the tourists. When I was actively doing that, this helped spread the disease very much. So
Right.
I don't do that anymore. I just have another quick question. BirdLife Australia, is that an organization of birders or?
Yes.
Oh,
So it's a huge bird promoting organization in Australia. They certainly cater to birders, and have got all the lifeless stuff and all that sort of thing going on. The other really interesting thing about BirdLife Australia is just, this is just a really kind of a strange example. A lot of you have probably heard of the Major Mitchell cockatoo. It's beautiful. It's pink. It's one of my very favorite things in the world to look at. It is no longer called the Major Mitchell cockatoo. It is now called the pink cockatoo, thanks to BirdLife Australia. This organization has been going through, so Major Mitchell was, he was a European colonizer who came in from Europe and basically slaughtered a lot of the Aboriginal population. Much like, you know, the European colonizers that came to the United States and what they did to our Native American population. So Major Mitchell, and he was not a nice man. A lot of people died at his hands. So there was a movement within BirdLife Australia to rename the Major Mitchell cockatoo. And so they have now, BirdLife Australia made an official name change recognized by the Australian government. It is now called the pink cockatoo and not the Major Mitchell, which for me, it's still really hard to not call them the Major Mitchell because I've spent my whole life calling them Major Mitchells. But yeah, so BirdLife Australia is a really fascinating organization. And they do all kinds of stuff in terms of bird conservation. They sponsor a lot of the bird counts in Australia, in all different states of Australia. They handle lots of different things.
So if one was interested in a birding trip to Australia or within any part of Australia, one could go to them and find out how to set up guides and or take. Oh, good. Okay, my last question is, you know, as far as public education goes about preserving the habitats or the birds or anything, is that going on actively in the schools and elsewhere?
It is. There a lot of these organizations I mentioned have programs where they push into the schools. Also, most of the zoos in Australia and sanctuaries have school programs where they are educating the educators as well as educating the students. So, for example, in the state of Victoria, which is the major city in Victoria is Melbourne. But they have an organization called Zoos Victoria, which runs some of their zoos and sanctuaries there. And Zoos Victoria, I've attended some of their teacher workshops online. But I wish I lived there because the programs they put on for students in trying to bring awareness to the birds is amazing, as well as the other creatures in Australia. But obviously, there's a big interest in the birds. There's one zoo outside of Melbourne that is very bird centric. They put on this amazing bird show. It's called the Healesville Sanctuary. And yes, they do have koalas and macropods and other things at the zoo, but the birds are really the stars. And their goal is to really educate people about birds and about the different species and what people can do to help in the conservation. As many of you may know, I live here in Monterey County. Both of my kids were heavily involved in the Monterey Bay Aquarium in their teen conservation leadership program. And the aquarium has always been a big supporter of things like aquariums and zoos because their philosophy is people will save what they love. And in order to achieve that, you need to get some sort of emotional connection between people and these creatures. And so places like Healesville Sanctuary, their goal is to help people build that emotional connection. And even going out into the schools, building an emotional connection between the kids and these fabulous creatures that are found nowhere else in the world but Australia. Working to help them develop an emotional bond so that these kids will grow up wanting to save what they love.
Exactly. It's all a part of creating a demand. If people love it, they will want to preserve it. I thank you so much, Julia, for all the wonderful pictures and information you've shared. I've learned a lot. I've been to Australia, but I learned a lot from hearing of your experience. And thank you so much. I do want to share with you one comment. There's been a couple of comments about changing the name of the Major Mitchells to pink, calling a white and salmon colored cockatoo the pink cockatoo. While there is truly a pink cockatoo, a galah is a bit confusing.
Yes.
Or maybe the galah already established, so pink was up for grabs. So
yeah.
maybe they could rethink that, you know.
Yeah.
We'll find maybe the dusky pink, or maybe.
I know. It is confusing. So like in my background here, these are galahs that are in a little, it's a suburb of Melbourne called Hoppers Crossing. I have bird friends that live there that have parrots. Um, so every time I'm in Melbourne, I spend time down in Hoppers Crossing, and we were driving down the street and I saw these galahs on somebody's front lawn, and I'm like, Yumi, stop the car. So we stopped and I jumped out with my camera. She had to pull me back. I almost got hit by a car. But and I said, I want to buy this house with the galahs on the front lawn.
Wow.
um, yes. But yes, so it is a little confusing that there are two species of pink cockatoos in Australia. So at some point, yeah, they might have to make some sort of differentiation in terms of the naming conventions.
I used to work in a botany department, and naming and renaming species is half of what they do. They fight over it all the time. I do hope, and another person who is listening in raised this too, that the Australian government will pay as much attention to other less popular species or less well-known ones. Certain parrots and things that they do to the cassowaries and a lot of the bird species of Kakadu. I want to thank you again, and I think we've run out of time. So this is the period of questions and answers. So I hope people will be firing questions at you, and we'll exercise you a little bit more. But thanks everyone for listening in. So we're open for questions now. Okay. Anybody?
And you can throw questions into the chat or the Q&A. The chat's probably easier for folks. I know there's at least one other fellow traveler to Australia that's piped in now and again. So perhaps there's, some other questions, and can be about us, travel in Australia, as well as subjects that may not have been covered by Julia, because she's definitely traveled there more than a few times. At this point, was it 4, 5 times?
I've been there 3 times for a total of 8 weeks.
Yeah, so long time.
So yeah, so I will probably 25 is kind of I've got 2 kids graduating from college in 25 and that need to move. So I'm going to be having my hands full in 25, so I'm not committing to any big trips, but I will definitely be heading back in 26 in March for the Bruny Island Bird Festival, and then I'd like to get back over to Western Australia in 26 as well for a few weeks. So yeah, so really interesting things. And in terms of the parrots, of course, seeing cockatoos like in your yard is like an amazing thing. But when we were up, just a side note, when we were up in Kakadu and I was staying at the Crocodile Hotel, one morning, super, super early, it was like 4 a.m. The sun was not up yet. It was dark. And I heard that my Australian friend had traveled with me out there. And she had the window propped open because she was hot, because it's hot everywhere in Queensland and Northern Territory, and heard this whole sound at like 4 a.m. when it was still dark. And I'm like, what is that? And then I realized it was birds, but I couldn't figure out what they were. It was still dark. Second morning, I got up and I was ready for them. And I went out and looked, and it was this flock of sulfur-crested cockatoos flying over. They sounded like a 747 jet engine. And there must have been 300 or 400 birds in this group flying over the hotel. And I'm like, that made me very thankful for only having 4 birds in my house in terms of sound making, noise making. But it's absolutely incredible to see these birds in their natural habitat.
Julia, how easy was it for you to see the wild cockatiels and budgies in Oz?
I have not yet seen the wild cockatiels and budgies. A lot of them are, as you mentioned, are out in the Catherines and in Central Australia. And I have not had any luck seeing them. I've seen, I think most varieties of cockatoo I've seen in the wild, except for the black palm, which I'm gonna have to, suck it up and charter a plane up to Cape York to go see one of those. But no, the budgies and the cockatiels are still on my list. So,
I could say I did get to see the wild budgies. We did fly in a chartered plane with 6 other people from Darwin out
mhm,
to can't remember the name of the town right now. I'm having a senior moment, but the main town out there in the Kimberleys where the diamond mines are.
mhm,
It's a small town. They do have hotels there, and from there we journeyed a little further uh, by van. It's another 4-wheel drive out to the field station. You do have to arrange that, but we did it through our travel agent. It can be done, or you can do it through a local guide, but you can get out there. And that was really the best place I found to see
mhm,
budgies. Uh,
right.
in the Sydney Zoo and the other places like that. But to see them in the wild, you got to go out, really go out in the outback.
They are definitely out in the outback. In towns you see a lot of the larger birds often, like the cockatoos, and that sort of thing, and even all of the lorikeets, because there are a million species of lorikeets. Even though most of us only are familiar with the rainbow, but lorikeets you'll see in town, but budgies and cockatiels you aren't going to find in a major urban center. So.
Somebody here did see lots of wild cockatiels. I did not get to see any in the wild, but I'm curious if Amy would tell us where she saw them.
Yeah.
Uh, Amy, if you're listening, would you like to share that information?
Yeah, and Amy, we've enabled your microphone so that you can chat if you'd like. And while Amy is figuring that one out, one thing that we were particularly entranced about, Julia, was the cockatoos, because some of them are tagged, we found, and the tags have numbers, and the numbers enable tracking and stories about the travels of those individual twos. Do you want to chat
Yeah.
about that a bit?
And that was primarily the Sydney population of sulfur crusteds that they're doing that on. And they have their own website. And as Pam discovered, you can follow the different birds. They're not doing that as much in other states. That's mainly in New South Wales that they're doing that. I think part of it is because those birds have become so urban, they're tracking them for studying them, in terms of how they're interacting with the urban setting.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and Amy says that she saw the cockatiels in Southwest Queensland in the outback, and she's busy bidding in the auction right now, which closes in, 7 minutes. So
Yeah.
priorities.
You
Yes.
gotta go to the outback.
Yeah.
You gotta get
Yeah.
out, drive or get somebody to go with you. But the outback is just everywhere you get out of a big city and you head inland. That's the outback. There's no destination that has a sign, welcome to the outback. It's just sort of all over the place. And but that's where you go. That's good to know. So you should put that on your itinerary for a future trip, Julia.
Yes. Yeah. No, definitely getting more into the outback is on my itinerary for a future trip. It's so hard to get to. So 90% of Australians live on a coast, because the outback is pretty inhospitable in a lot of ways. And the towns are very remote from each other and can be hard to get to. In fact, you see these fuel trucks. So like here we are accustomed on our freeways, we'll see a tanker truck for gas with 2 trailers. And when they go into the outback, they will often have 4 or 5 fuel trailers, or the trailers. So it's like this huge, they call it a road train. Because they will have to bring to some of these towns like a month's worth of fuel at a time because they are so remote. So yeah, it's harder to get out there, but I imagine that's why the budgies and the cockatiels do well out there in humans.
The name of the city in the Kimberleys that's the main city out there. It's, I think the only one is Kununurra. And that's
Okay.
a small population, but because of the diamond mines there, the diamonds come in different colors depending on
Right.
the mine. And they have several diamond shops there. And that's one of the reasons it's a tourist destination. But from there, you can get out and see and everything. And there are remote places to stay.
And during our next total solar eclipse, it's going to be tracking through the Kimberleys and then ultimately end down in Sydney. So they're kind of gearing up for a lot of tourists when that happens.
It gets over 120 degrees. I'm not talking about the
Yes.
summertime. I'm talking about the
Yeah.
spring.
Yes. Yeah.
Since there is.
So we had a question for you, Julia. Did you go to Alice Springs?
So I had on the list for this last trip. It did not happen. We ran into some time constraints. Alice Springs is, you can fly to it. It's expensive to fly to. You can drive to it. Just I ran out of time. So I am planning to get to Alice Springs at some point. There's actually a macropod sanctuary there for kangaroos that I am hoping to go volunteer at in Alice Springs. It's not a particularly safe town, though. They're having a lot of issues with high crime rates there, high alcoholism rates. It's really the middle of nowhere. But that is on my list to go see, as well as Uluru, and dropping down into Coober Pedy, which is an opal mining town. It's where most of the world's white opals come from, but it's so hot there, they built the entire town underground. So all of the houses, the hotels, the stores, everything is built down in what they call dugouts. So people literally live underground because it is so extreme there in terms of heat. And then in the winter, it gets real cold.
Apparently, if you get to Alice Springs, the birds that line the telephone lines are gallows. So
Yes, yes. I was telling Linda a couple days ago, when I was driving out of Cairns one day, I pulled up to a stoplight and I looked up and I thought there were crows on the stoplight. And then I looked closer. I'm like, those aren't crows. Those are red-tailed black cockatoos. A bunch of them just sitting up there. I'm like, wow. And then people started honking because I wasn't going when the light turned green because I was too busy looking at the red-tailed black cockatoos sitting on the light.
yeah, well, we could go on forever, and
Yeah.
perhaps that'll be a subject of a different one. Right now, it's 2 minutes to the end of the auction. So let me take this moment to thank Julia and Linda for their time on this
Thank you.
presentation, as well as preparing for the presentation. Yay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.